Hey photographers, you'd like to know which lenses you should buy for your Fuji camera. So I asked both Fujifilm Canada and B&H Photo to send over a few so that I could show you. I'm going to demo with the Fuji X-H1, but these lenses will work with all Fuji cameras that have interchangeable X-mount lenses. I can't provide the kind of detailed analysis and testing that sites like DxOMark, DP Review, and others provide. So this is mostly an overview, but I'll provide a bunch of samples along the way. Check those sites out for the detailed tests. The links are below. Now lenses, although they have fewer buttons, dials, and features, are just as important as the camera in a photography system. They deliver the light to the sensor. Now, there is no best lens. I'm going to give you the information you need to make an informed decision for your photos and your creativity to select the best lens for you. All of these lenses are designed for Fuji's APS-C sensors. Fuji also makes lenses for the GFX camera, which has a larger sensor. Those are not X-mount and not compatible with other Fuji models. And let's start with the FUJINON XF 18-135 f3.5 to 5.6 R LM OIS WR. That's a mouthful, so let's parse it out. Fuji's lens division is called FUJINON. It's a very highly regarded brand used in many professional broadcast video applications. For X-mount cameras, FUJINON makes two series of lenses, XC and XF. To generalize, XC lenses are smaller, lighter, and less expensive. They have plastic lens mounts and don't have aperture rings. The XF series are the better lenses, metal mounts, aperture rings, and they're typically larger. However, even within the XF series, there's a distinction. Red label or red badge lenses are an even higher class of optics, function, and yes, price. So, XF. Then, 18-135. That says that this is a zoom lens with a focal length that can be changed from 18-135. And that's slightly confusing, as those numbers apply to 35mm format, and X-mount cameras all have APS-C size crop sensors. So with the 1.5 crop applied, the actual focal length is 27-206mm. That's a 7.5 times zoom. Photographers call fully zoomed out wide and fully zoomed in tight. I don't know why lens manufacturers don't state focal length in terms of angle of view and stop confusing us with 35mm equivalent, but we're kind of stuck with that. So for this lens, the angle of view is 76.5 degrees when wide, 12 degrees when fully zoomed in, and that really defines the difference. For example, this image was taken at the wide 18mm end, and this image at the tight 135mm end. Even though the subject is the same, the field of view changes the background. Now, as a rule, a larger focal length will provide a smaller, less busy, more defocused background. f3.5 to f5.6. f-stops define the size of the lens opening. The aperture. Now here, it's stating the widest aperture of the lens, the maximum size of the opening to let in light. And that's the number we're most interested in. Two numbers are given as this lens ramps. As you zoom in, the aperture closes. So at the widest focal length, the aperture is at its widest, f3.5. As I zoom in, the aperture closes. So when tight, the aperture is smaller, f5.6. So yeah, I get that there's confusion here. Why are large apertures small f numbers? Well, with apologies, it's a reciprocal and refers to a fraction of the opening. Larger f numbers block more light. Now, a bunch of letters. R means the lens has an aperture ring. An aperture ring can be preferred by some photographers as it enables physical and manual control. You won't have to find another dial or on-screen setting to set the f-stop. LM means the focus system uses a linear motor. While that's true, this is a fairly meaningless marketing term. OIS means optical image stabilization. That means the lens will provide some stabilization to a handheld shot. And this is mostly useful for long focal lengths in low light situations, as it enables a faster shutter speed or a lower ISO. A mechanism inside the lens counteracts the movement it's sensing. Now, this is not the same as in-body stabilization, but typically the two, optical and in-body, work together to create a stable image as they do here in the X-H1. WR means weather resistant, although interpreting what that means can be difficult. Let's assume weather resistant is not waterproof. Then there are all the things the label doesn't say. A bunch of things I find useful to know. You'll typically find those in the specifications. For example, the size of the filter mount. In this case, it's 67 millimeters, and that's the size of UV or ND filter that you would need for this lens. And although I'm generalizing, a larger filter diameter means a better lens. And there's one more thing. Weight. Again, generalizing, but heavier lenses are better lenses. After all, glass and metal are heavier than plastic. Then, there's the closest focus distance. For this lens, that's 45 centimeters. But what's even more useful to know is how large an area that represents. I measure that by putting a ruler across the screen at the closest focal distance. Now, I'd also like to know how far the zoom ring travel is. If it needs to be rotated more than 1/4 turn from wide to tight, that will require you to reposition your hand during the zoom. And I'd also like to know how far the lens extends when it's zoomed. This lens has two switches, OIS to turn stabilization on and off, and one to select auto or manual aperture. A is auto, which means nothing changes when you turn the aperture ring. The 18-135 lens has 3 rings: aperture, zoom, and focus. Only the zoom ring is labeled, which I call defined travel. It stops turning when you get to the wide or the tight end. To see the aperture setting, you'll have to check on screen, or the info panel on top of the X-H1. The focus distance setting also appears on screen, but only when you're in manual focus mode, and like the aperture ring, when the autofocus is on, either in single or continuous, the focus ring is disabled. Like most lenses, this focus ring turns indefinitely. When the ring is turned quickly, it changes the focus distance a lot, slowly, just a little. And that means it uses focus by wire. So if you want a specific distance, you can't judge by the position or the amount of movement of the ring. And as long as we're looking at the focus distance, note that there's a blue bar on either side of the focus distance setting. That blue bar is the depth of field, showing the amount of the image in front of and behind the focus point that is also in focus. The depth of field will change as you adjust the aperture. Larger f-stops have a larger depth of field. All right. Now, let's have a look at the XF red badge 16 to 55 millimeter f2.8 R LMWR. Now, just from the label, we can see that this lens has a slightly wider field of view, 16 millimeters, and doesn't zoom as far, only 55 millimeters. The minimum aperture is f2.8. That's wider, and it's constant. It doesn't ramp as you zoom, and there's no optical stabilization. A wide aperture is sometimes called a fast aperture. By fast, photographers mean that they can use a shorter, faster shutter speed. A smaller aperture requires a slower shutter speed to let in more light under the same conditions. Mostly, portrait photographers prefer a larger aperture, landscape photographers prefer smaller apertures. In this scene, at a smaller aperture, both tulips are in focus, but as I open the aperture to a smaller f-stop, the tulip in the back gets increasingly softer. If you are trying to achieve a defocused background, both a smaller f-stop and a tighter zoom will help. Now here's the scene at 16mm and at 55mm, although I had to reposition the camera to keep the composition constant. At 655 grams, this lens is heavier than the 18-135, and the filter diameter, 72mm, is larger. It's also more expensive, in Canada about 30% more. The aperture ring is marked and defined travel, like the zoom. The focus is focus by wire. The closest focus distance is about 30 centimeters when wide, 40 when tight. Now, even at 4K, the 8 megapixel resolution of video can't really provide enough quality to judge between these two lenses. These two images were taken at 55mm with the same f5.6 aperture. Is there a difference? And let me show you one more thing. Watch as I zoom in with the 18-135. I'm using manual focus, and all I'm changing is the zoom. And now with the 16-55. As the focal length changes, the focus adjusts. It gets back to focus, but it doesn't stay continuously in focus as I zoom. The 16-55 is better, but neither of these lenses are parfocal, which is the term used for lenses that maintain focus while zooming. Fuji's new MK series of X-mount cinema lenses are parfocal. Hope to include those in a review soon. Now, although the 18-135 provides a longer reach than the 16-55, these are both general-purpose zooms, good for walkabout photography, suitable for most situations. And if you prefer the 16-55, but also want an extended reach, Fuji does make a companion lens, the XF Red Badge 60-140mm f2.8 RLM OIS WR. Same 72mm filter diameter, and it weighs close to 1 kilo, which will put some strain on the camera, so Fuji has added a tripod mount to help the balance and shift the weight. The ring for the mount can be set for either landscape or portrait. Its interesting characteristic, though, is an all-internal zoom. It zooms without extending the barrel. In my book, that's a highly desirable attribute, particularly on a tripod, especially on a stabilizer. And if 140mm isn't tight enough, Fuji does make several more zooms. This is the XF Red Badge 100-400. f4.5 to 5.6 RLM OIS WR. The 35mm equivalent is 152 to 609. That's a field of view of 4 degrees. And that can get you quite close to a faraway subject. It's great for wildlife and birding. Again, a tripod mount for balance. 77mm filter diameter, 1.4 kilos. Quarter turn zoom ring, and the lens extends about 6 centimeters for a total length of 28 centimeters. The aperture isn't marked, and in addition to stabilization and aperture switches, there's a focus range switch and a lock for the zoom so it doesn't go sliding off accidentally. Now, we've zoomed in pretty far to 4 degrees. Let's go the other way. I'm going to do that with a third-party lens, a ROKINON 8mm f2.8 ED AS IF UMC fisheye. It's on loan from B&H. ROKINON's lens terms aren't the same as Fuji's. 8mm represents a field of view of 180 degrees. Fisheye means that the view will be distorted, like this. That doesn't zoom. Lenses that have a single fixed focal length are usually called prime lenses. The aperture ranges from f2.8 to f22 using a clicked or detented ring. Unlike the Fuji manual apertures, which have an auto switch, this lens is manual only. And the focus ring on this lens, with the defined travel and marked settings from 30 centimeters to infinity, is also manual. This lens can't be autofocused. IF means internal focus. The lens doesn't extend as it's focused. I think ED, UMC, and AS refer to shape and coating of the lens's internal elements. ROKINON doesn't bother to define these. At 275 grams, it's light, and the lens bubbles out. There's no ability to add filters to this lens. It's also an inexpensive lens, but don't judge it too harshly. This is a special purpose lens. It's very useful in small places, or to capture a large view. Now, prime lenses are available at many focal lengths, typically primes, as they have fewer moving elements, provide a higher quality and a larger aperture at a lower price. Some typical lengths are 35 millimeters for street photography, 50 and 85 millimeters for portraits. But remember, those are the 35 millimeter equivalents. This is the ROKINON 85mm f1.4, which on this camera is 127 millimeters or a field of view of 19 degrees. Closest focus 1 meter, 615 grams, 72 millimeter filter diameter. Now, this nifty little lens is the FUJINON XF 23mm f2 RWR. Its small size and fast aperture make it a favorite match for Fuji's smaller street shooters like the XE3 or the XT20. But of course, it works here too. And all the Fuji guys love this one. With the 1.5 crop, this is a 35mm lens with a 63-degree field of view. I like this lens for video, particularly when shooting on a stabilizer, as it's small and light, 180 grams, and the focus is fast. There's an aperture ring, you knew that from the R in the name, which goes from f2 to f16 and includes auto. There's an unmarked focus by wire focus ring. Filter diameter is 43 millimeters, and the closest focus distance is 22 centimeters. Now, my preferred prime is the slightly wider XF 16mm f1.4 RWR. With an 83-degree field of view, a super fast aperture, and a marked and defined travel manual focus ring, it provides me a lot of satisfaction for cityscapes, landscapes, and interior. And actually, that focus ring is interesting. It's a clutch. Push it out and it locks, so you can use the camera's autofocus. Pull it in, and the distance ring appears 15 centimeters to infinity. At 375 grams, it's not particularly light. The filter diameter is 67 millimeters, and because it only closes to f16 and the smallest ISO Fuji provides is 200, you'll want an ND filter. Now, I've mentioned the closest focus distance for the lenses that we've looked at so far, and if you're trying to get a tight close-up of a small area, as I do when showing a camera's controls, you'll want a macro lens. This is the Fuji XF 80mm f2.8 LM OIS WR macro. Its field of view is 20 degrees. Its closest focus distance is 25 centimeters, but the difference is the magnification. This is 1:1. Most lenses have a smaller magnifier. The 23mm, for example, is 0.13. At 750 grams, this is a heavy lens, with a filter diameter of 62 millimeters, and it's 13 centimeters long. Because the area is small, macro lenses have a very shallow depth of field, even with smaller apertures. I would prefer a macro lens that can work a little bit closer, but the distance means that the lens is less likely to throw a shadow on a close subject. Fuji also makes an XF 60mm f2.4R macro lens. So I just about finished this video, and although I'd asked for Fuji to include a kit lens in the original loan, I received these two last night. So I've scrapped the original ending of this video to include them. It should have been earlier in the video, but here we go. This is the XF 18-55 f2.8-4 RLMOIS, which has been Fuji's go-to kit lens for a couple of years. And this is the newer XC 15-45 f3.5-5.6 OIS PZ, the new kit lens that's included with the XA5. And there's a new term, PZ, which means power zoom. Now, there's no aperture ring, and the zoom ring doesn't turn, it just rotates slightly in either direction to engage the zoom motor. As kit lenses go, the 18-55 is considerably above average, with a metal mount, aperture ring, and optical stabilization. The filter diameter is 58 millimeters. It weighs 310 grams. The closest focus distance is 30 centimeters wide, 40 centimeters tight. Now the 15-45 extends when the camera is powered on, and the barrel moves in and out as you zoom in. It has a filter diameter of 52 millimeters, weighs 135 grams, 13 centimeters when wide, 35 when tight. Then this is the smallest and lightest X-mount lens in Fuji's lineup. I'm not a big fan of motorized zooms, also called zoom-by-wire, as I usually can't get the smooth, organic start and stop I can with a manual zoom, but I found this lens not so bad. Anyway, that's a concern primarily for video shooting. So I took these two, along with the red badge 16-55 downtown, to show you the difference you might observe in image quality among these lenses. Now, these images are on my FLICKR feed, so you can see them at full resolution and check out the EXIF data. I thought I'd be able to see the difference, particularly when zoomed in to 100% view, and even more at 200% when I look into the corners of the image. The softness I expected to see in the kit lenses, or the chromatic aberration in the corners, not so much. Now let me finish with a few thoughts about video, but I promise to go deeper when I review Fuji's MK series cinema lenses. Cinematographers prefer to shoot with prime lenses and prefer fully manual settings, and that makes it possible to edit seamlessly between multiple takes, multiple angles, and multiple focal lengths, well, lenses, and retain consistent focus and exposure settings. And a manual-defined focus travel ring allows the cinematographer, or more likely their assistant, to adjudge the focus accurately and quickly when changing focus from one subject to another. This is called rack focus, and I will note that touch focus is a much simpler way to do this. The aperture of a cinema lens is typically measured in t-stops, which measure the amount of light transmitted, as opposed to f-stops, which measure the size of the opening. Now, on the X-H1, a screen display option provides the ability to switch between f-stops and t-stops as long as the appropriate lens type is connected. And let me close with a caveat, which is, please don't consider me or this video as your only source for choosing a lens. And let me recommend the Wirecutter's excellent post on Fuji X-mount lenses. I've provided the link in the description below. And I'm always happy to respond to relevant questions and civil comments. Thanks for watching. Thanks so much for subscribing.